I was recently taken aback to discover that a significant fire had occurred at Ever Trust Company, where my husband Richard works. It felt as though I had been hit over the head with a heavy weight, my heart racing with concern. I quickly dialed Richard's number, fervently hoping he was unharmed. When the phone rang and his voice finally came through, a wave of relief washed over me. "Where are you? Are you safe?" I asked, my voice rising in volume from anxiety and relief. To my surprise, Richard responded with irritation, his tone sharp. "What's the matter with you? You're so loud. I'm at work. Don't call me while I'm working." He abruptly hung up, leaving me confused and unsettled. While he didn't appear to be directly involved in the fire, his dismissive reaction was troubling. "My name is Sarah, and I'm 35 years old. Nursing is a significant part of my life. I married Richard 4 years ago, just as I was nearing the end of my 20s. We met through a mutual friend and quickly connected, leading to what I thought was a blissful marriage. We've been living in company housing provided by his employer. Despite not having children yet, I remain hopeful about building a happy family with Richard. He can be self-centered at times, but he's generally a kind and loving man who makes me feel secure. Recently, however, he seems overly preoccupied with work, often bringing tasks home even on his days off, which leaves him visibly exhausted. Richard's detachment has seeped into our evenings. After dinner, he often slumps on the sofa, ostensibly watching TV, but he's mostly fixated on his phone, using the television as mere background noise. Whenever I try to engage him in conversation, his responses are brief, typically just a "yeah" or an "oh," which makes me question whether I've done something to upset him. This recent shift in his behavior is puzzling and concerning. Choosing to believe that Richard is simply overwhelmed by his demanding job, I decided to help ease his burden. I committed to making sure he had a warm lunch and a hearty dinner waiting for him every day, preparing nutritious meals to support him through his long days. Just as I was settling into this routine, an unexpected change threw everything into disarray. A colleague called the day before, asking if I could swap my night shift for a day shift. This sudden change meant I would be home in the evening, and I planned to inform Richard about it amid the chaos of my new schedule. I managed to email Richard about the shift change on the day itself, letting him know not to worry about dinner since I would prepare it once I got home. Strangely, I didn't receive a response. I figured he was swamped with work, so I focused on my duties. Even after my shift ended, there was still no word from him. This was unusual. Richard typically replied promptly to my messages during his breaks, often using emojis to keep the tone light. But this time, he had only read my message and didn't respond. I began to wonder if he was buried under work or if this silence signaled something more concerning, a shift that can sometimes happen after years of marriage. Feeling a bit down, I stopped at the supermarket on my way home. Despite the cold weather, I was determined to make a warm one-pot meal for us. I picked up all the necessary ingredients, ready to start cooking as soon as Richard walked through the door. However, he didn't come home at his usual time of 6 p.m. The hours dragged on, and by the time he finally arrived at 9 p.m., I felt a mix of relief and worry. As he entered, I greeted him, trying to keep the mood light. "Welcome back. You're home late. Did you have to work overtime?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern, hoping for a simple explanation. "Yeah, but did you really have to switch to day shift so suddenly?" Richard replied as he walked into the kitchen. I nodded, sensing the tension. "Yes, a coworker had an emergency, and I was late in telling you about the change," I explained. "I see. I guess you couldn't help it," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "But it's a bit annoying that you only informed me today. I might have made plans to go out for a drink or something." "You're right. I'm sorry," I said, feeling the weight of his disappointment. I replied as I turned on the stove to heat the pot. "Oh, you haven't eaten yet." Richard noticed the setup. "No, I thought I'd wait for you," I said, hoping he'd appreciate the gesture. "Well, thanks, but next time you don't have to wait for me," he said. His words stung a little. I had hoped for a cozy evening together. I sighed quietly as I waited for the pot to boil. Once it started to simmer, I served up Richard's portion, followed by mine. I was famished after waiting all evening, and the hot pot was delicious. I began to savor each bite, but then I noticed that Richard wasn't eating much. "What's wrong? You don't seem to be eating," I remarked. "Oh, yes," he muttered, looking distracted. Then he admitted, "I worked late, and a junior colleague bought me a rice bowl at work, so I'm not hungry." But you should have told me that earlier, I replied, feeling a mix of disappointment and frustration. You could have sent a quick message before I started cooking. I think Richard sensed my irritation because he quickly suggested, okay, then put my portion in the fridge. I'll eat it tomorrow morning. He tried to lighten the mood, but the atmosphere was already strained. After a few minutes of silence, Richard got up from the couch and suddenly announced, I'm going for a walk. His abrupt decision to leave the house after our interaction felt unusual, leaving me puzzled about what was going on with him lately. When I expressed my concern about his sudden urge to walk, Richard explained, I haven't been getting enough exercise lately, and with all the late work hours, I just need a change of pace. He began preparing to head out, leaving me feeling hollow as I sat alone at the dining table with the hot pot in front of me. Eventually, I decided to put my portion in the fridge, feeling slightly overstuffed. I realized that Richard and I hadn't spent much quality time together lately, so I suggested joining him for a walk, hoping it might provide an opportunity for us to reconnect. However, Richard declined my offer. It's not good to move around right after eating. Besides, I need to take a long walk alone tonight, he said before leaving the house by himself. His behavior struck me as odd, and driven by a nagging instinct, I discreetly followed him from a distance. Despite the cool evening air, Richard walked with an unusual spring in his step. He eventually stopped near a park quite a distance from our home, where he seemed to be waiting for someone, frequently checking his phone. A few minutes later, a car pulled up, and Richard strolled over, chatting casually with the driver. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer to get a better look through the car window. Inside sat a woman with long curly hair and shiny lipstick, laughing joyfully as Richard climbed into the passenger seat. The sight felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't shake the thought that he might be having an affair. Just as I was processing the scene, the car drove off with them, leaving me standing there, stunned and struggling to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Not long after, Richard texted me, claiming he had unexpectedly run into an acquaintance and would be home late. His explanation felt far too convenient, and deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The trust I had in him began to waver. My trust in him was shaken as I struggled to comprehend the reality of the situation. He had claimed he wasn't hungry because he had already eaten, yet it was past 3:00 a.m. when my husband finally came home. He stumbled in, seemingly tipsy, and headed straight to the kitchen for a glass of water, completely unaware that I was awake. Since that night, he had often stayed late at work, especially when I was on the day shift. Synchronizing our days off had always been a challenge, but now it felt nearly impossible. Recently, he was not only working late but also putting in hours on what were supposed to be his days off. I couldn't shake the suspicion that he might be meeting the woman I had seen with him that night. Driven by doubt, I began searching for detective agencies online. After some digging, I submitted an investigation request to the most reputable one I could find. I felt guilty for going behind his back, but I reasoned that if the investigation cleared him, I could fully trust him again. Waiting for the results was excruciating. My husband remained as reserved as ever, and every time I looked at him, the image of that woman haunted me. I was desperate for clarity. Then an unexpected event occurred. It was a busy Saturday at the hospital where I worked, and my husband was supposedly working on his day off. As I focused on my tasks, trying to push aside my personal issues, the distant sound of fire truck sirens caught my attention. The noise grew louder and more urgent, and soon it wasn't just one fire truck, but several speeding by. A sense of unease crept over me, turning into worry as two of my colleagues returned to the ward with grave expressions. They were discussing an emergency, a large fire nearby. You mean the fire? I asked, trying to catch up with their conversation. Yes, that's right, they confirmed. There's a major fire at Trust Company. The shock hit me like a physical blow. Trust Company was where my husband worked. An overwhelming sense of distress washed over me as I considered the danger he might be in. Learning that the fire was at Trust filled me with immediate dread. I quickly explained the situation to my colleagues and rushed to call Richard, hoping against hope that he was safe. Despite the recent tension between us, I always made sure to see him off each morning, and now I dialed his number with a heavy heart, praying fervently that he hadn't been caught in the blaze. The phone rang, and when Richard's voice finally came through, it momentarily lifted my spirits. Hello, Richard. Are you safe? I asked, my voice louder than intended with relief. Instead of the reassurance I craved, His response was curt and irritated. "What's the matter with you? You're talking so loud. I'm at work. Don't call me while I'm working." Then the call abruptly ended. Confusion and anger surged within me. There was a massive fire with trucks dispatched to the scene. It was impossible for him to be working normally under those circumstances. His cold demeanor and strange response made me question whether he had even gone to work at all or if something else was happening. As my worry for his safety morphed into suspicion about his fidelity, I couldn't shake the thought of all those mornings I had seen him off. Was he using that time to meet someone else? By the time I reached home, my mind was made up. I needed to leave and start anew. As I began packing my belongings, I felt a mix of determination and sadness. I checked the mailbox and found that the results from the detective agency had arrived. It felt timely to take these with me as I left a house that no longer felt like home. My parents came over to help me pack, and I arranged for a moving contractor to expedite the process. As I worked amid the boxes, it struck me that Richard was probably unaware I knew the truth about his affairs, likely spending time with his lover at that very moment. I packed up my furniture and the appliances that had been with me since my Sable days. The room quickly emptied, becoming the hollow shell of the home it once was. Standing there, looking around at the nearly bare space, I realized how much I had changed and how necessary it was for me to move on from this chapter of my life. I felt completely detached from the life I once led in that house. With resolve, I moved my belongings to my parents' home and began searching for a new place to live on my own. The next day, Richard finally reached out, his voice laced with confusion and annoyance. "Hey, what's going on? Most of your stuff is gone." "I've moved out," I replied calmly. "What the hell were you thinking? When are you coming back? What about my food? What about the house chores?" His questions revealed everything. He was solely focused on how my departure affected him. Hearing his words stunned me, but I wasn't entirely surprised. "Is that all you think about when it comes to me?" I asked, disappointment heavy in my voice. Our conversation brought back memories of the fire at his company, a day he claimed to be tied up at the office, yet he seemed far too carefree given the circumstances. "Why don't you find another woman to handle all that?" I challenged, struggling to keep my composure. "What are you talking about?" he replied, genuinely confused. "You were with a woman named Kelly today, weren't you?" "Huh. What are you talking about? I was working at the office." "Oh, at the office? How long did you work today?" My suspicion intensified as the day grew busier, even though I was supposed to be off. I ended up working late into the evening, which made Richard's bewilderment over my move seem all the more suspicious. "That's why I was so surprised that you moved out," he said, trying to sound genuinely confused. "Stop lying already," I shot back sharply. "You lied about going to work, didn't you?" "I wasn't lying. I was working. What's going on?" His voice wavered between frustration and confusion. "How could you work late when there was a fire at your office during the day? When I called you, several fire trucks were dispatched to your company. They were there to extinguish the flames. That's why I called. I wanted to know if you were okay. You told me not to call you while you were at work, acting as if there was no fire." His silence spoke volumes, confirming my deepest doubts. The reality of the situation settled in, exposing the fissures in our relationship and making the distance between us feel more pronounced than ever. Armed with irrefutable evidence from the detective agency, I knew I had the upper hand. "There's no way you can escape this," I stated firmly. "From now on, all communication will go through my lawyer." As expected, he pleaded for forgiveness, repeatedly apologizing for his betrayal. But my feelings for him had faded long ago. "I'm sorry, but there's no fixing this. I'm hanging up now," I said, cutting off any further attempts at reconciliation. I promptly met with my lawyer to demand a divorce and alimony. With solid evidence in hand, the proceedings moved swiftly, and the divorce was finalized. Richard, along with his accomplice from work, a junior colleague, was ordered to pay a significant amount in alimony. Their affair not only had personal repercussions but professional ones as well. Once the news spread throughout the company, especially under the dramatic circumstances of the fire, it sparked widespread disdain among their peers. Both Richard and his affair partner faced cold stares and harsh judgments, a social penalty that visibly embarrassed them. Meanwhile, I settled into a new apartment, embracing my independence. The stability of my nursing career provided me with comfort, allowing me to take things slowly without rushing into another relationship. I reveled in my newfound solitude, appreciating the peace that came with it. Discovering my husband's affair, especially amidst the chaos of the fire, felt like a harsh twist of fate, yet it expedited the inevitable consequences he deserved. Now, as I adjusted to my single life, I looked forward to the possibility of meeting someone genuine in the future, without any rush, savoring each moment as it came.